Hey guys, CatsyCon16 here. This is Megan. I wanted to do another true crime case, and I think I found one that you guys will find pretty interesting. It takes place in 1956, and it is the unsolved murders of Barbara and Patricia Grimes, and it takes place in Chicago. As always, after watching the video, let me know who you think is guilty and just your thoughts in general in the comments below. Let's get started. On December 28, 1956, Barbara and Patricia Grimes, ages 15 and 12, disappeared while traveling from a movie theater in the Brighton Park neighborhood of Chicago to their McKinley Park home. Their disappearance became one of the largest missing persons cases in the history of Chicago. Their nude bodies were discovered along a deserted road in Willow Springs on January 22, 1957. To this day, the case remains unsolved. Although their autopsy reports concluded they were murdered within 5 hours of their last confirmed sighting, and both had died of secondary shock, numerous individuals claimed to have seen the girls alive in the weeks between the night of December 28th and the discovery of their bodies on January 22nd. The murder of the sisters was described as a crime that shattered the innocence of Chicago. The case is acknowledged as one of the most labor-intensive missing person and murder investigations in Cook County and remains one of Chicago's most infamous cold cases. On December 28, 1956, 2 of the 7 children born to Joseph and Loretta Grimes, Barbara and Patricia, wanted to see a screening of the Elvis Presley film Love Me Tender at a Brighton Park theater. Both girls were described as being inseparable and attentive students at the Thomas Kelly and St. Maurice high schools they attended. They are also known to have been devoted fans of Elvis. This particular day was the 11th time they had seen this movie, and they were known to have left their home around 7:30 p.m., having promised their mom they'd be home before midnight. The Brighton Theater was located 1.5 miles from their home, and they were said to have had $2.50 in their possession at the time of leaving their home. Barbara was instructed to keep the 50 cents of this money in the zipper of her wallet should they opt out to view the second screening of the film scheduled to be shown that evening. It is unknown if they actually traveled to Brighton Theater on this date, although they had invariably either walked or traveled by the bus to this destination many times before. A school friend of Patricia, Dorothy Weinert, would later tell investigators she was seated behind the girls with her younger sister during the showing. Although Weinert and her sister had left the theater at the intermission of the double feature screened at the Brighton Theater that night, approximately at 9:30 p.m. As they did, Dorothy saw the Grimes sisters in line to purchase popcorn. They seemed in good spirits, and she didn't notice anything odd in their demeanor. Both sisters stayed to view the second screening of Love Me Tender, thus meaning they would be expected to return home around 11:45 p.m. When they hadn't arrived home by midnight, their mother sent their older sister Teresa and their brother Joey to wait by the bus stop located closest to their home for their arrival. After 3 buses had driven by without either girl appearing at the designated stop, both siblings decided to go home. Having by this stage unsuccessfully contacting the girls' friends in the hope their daughters may be at one of their homes, and the return of Teresa and Joey to the family home without their sisters, Loretta filed a missing person report on her daughters with the Chicago Police Department at 2:15 a.m. on December 29th. The disappearance of the Grimes sisters sparked one of the largest missing person cases in the history of Cook County. A citywide search for the girls was quickly initiated, to which hundreds of police officers were subsequently assigned full-time. Cook County officers were assisted by colleagues from surrounding suburbs, and a task force devoted solely to locating the sisters was formed, with the ground search initiated on December 29th, being bolstered by hundreds of local volunteers. Police conducted door-to-door canvassing throughout Brighton Park, and numerous canals and rivers were dragged. In addition, more than 15,000 flyers were distributed to local homes, and parishioners of the Sisters Church offered a $1,000 reward for information leading to their whereabouts. As a result of this coordinated investigation, 300,000 people would be questioned, with some 2,000 individuals subjected to serious interrogation pertaining to their potential culpability. Although the 2 arrests and charges brought against individuals who confessed to the crime subsequently collapsed. One individual, Edward Bedwell, asserted he had been coerced into giving a confession after being subjected to a prolonged interrogation. Despite police efforts and extensive media appeals producing many reported sightings of the girls, little in the way of hard evidence was yielded, although several teenagers who had been at the Brighton Theater on December 28th did inform investigators they had seen the sisters conversing with, then entering a car driven by a young man whose physical appearance had been similar to that of Elvis Presley. The vehicle described by these eyewitnesses was consistently described as being a Mercury model. Prior to the implementation of the task force, and despite protests from the girls' parents, several investigators initially assigned to the case theorized the sisters had either run away from the home or were voluntarily staying with boyfriends. Although the sisters were front-page news by December 31st, their disappearance would only be seriously considered as a missing persons case, and thus appropriately treated as such, by investigators after approximately 1 week had passed without family and friends receiving any form of contact from either girl. Nonetheless, extensive media appeals were conducted, imploring both sisters to return home, and for any eyewitnesses to contact police. Resultingly, numerous alleged sightings of the girls would be reported to police as late as January 9th, and these reports often described one or both of the girls as having been seen in various business establishments. These sightings supported several investigators' initial theories the girls had opted to leave home of their own accord. Theories also abounded that the sisters may have possibly traveled to Nashville, Tennessee to see Presley in concert, or they had simply left their home on their own volition as the means of emulating Presley's lifestyle. In the event her daughters had actually been kidnapped, Loretta Grimes publicly pleaded, "If someone is holding them, please let the girls call me," adding, "I'll forgive them from the bottom of my heart." On January 19, 1957, an official statement was issued from Presley's Graceland estate. This televised statement read, "If you are good Presley fans, you'll go home and ease your mother's worries." Presley is also known to have made a direct radio plea to the Grimes sisters, imploring the girls to return home to their mother. On January 22, 1957, following a rapid thaw of recent snowfall, a construction worker named Leonard Prescott spotted what he later described as being these flesh-colored things behind a guardrail as he drove along a rural country road named German Church Road, approximately 200 feet east of County Line Road in unincorporated Willow Springs. Initially unsure of the origin of what he had seen and believing the forms may be mannequins, Prescott later returned to the site with his wife Marie, who fainted upon taking a closer look at what her husband had seen earlier. The forms were actually the nude, frozen bodies of the Grimes sisters, and the Prescotts immediately reported their findings to the Willow Springs Police Department. The girls' bodies lay upon a flat, horizontal section of snow-covered ground directly behind the guardrail, which extended for just 10 feet before the incline of the embankment of Devil's Creek. Barbara lay on her left side with her legs drawn slightly up toward her torso, and Patricia lay on her back with her body covering her sister's head, and her own head turned sharply to the right. It is believed the sisters had most likely been driven to this location in a car, with their bodies then being dragged or lifted out of the vehicle, then placed or thrown behind the guardrail. 3 wounds resembling those typically inflicted by ice picks were discovered upon Barbara's chest, and injuries resembling blunt force trauma were visible upon her face and head, whereas numerous injuries resembling bruises were also discovered upon Patricia's face and body. The girl's father, Joseph Grimes, was driven to the crime scene to formally identify both bodies. Following Joseph's initial positive identification of the bodies, over 160 police officers from several suburban Chicago police departments, assisted by numerous local volunteers, conducted a search of the crime scene with the additional assistance of the forest preserves. This search uncovered little to no real evidence linked to the crime, and the search itself would later be severely criticized due to those organizing the search allowing untrained individuals to trample over any evidence which may have been at the location. These autopsies would be performed by 3 experienced forensic pathologists who, following a 5-hour examination of each body, were unable to reach an agreement on either a date or cause of death. These experts did determine via an examination of the sisters' stomach contents that both girls had most likely died within approximately 5 hours of the time they had last been seen alive at the Brighton Theater, thus affixing the most likely time of death in each instance to have been either in the late evening of December 28th or the early morning of December 29th. The cause of death in each case was ruled as being a combination of shock and exposure, although each pathologist reached this conclusion via a process of eliminating other causes. In addition, these experts concluded that many of the wounds discovered upon the girls' bodies had most likely been inflicted by rodents, with the actual puncture wounds having been most likely inflicted after death. No obviously fatal wounds were discovered upon either girl's body, and toxicology reports revealed that neither girl had been drunk, drugged, or poisoned prior to their death. No items of the sisters' clothing were ever found, although their bodies were described by the pathologist as being markedly clean. The autopsies would also discover that Barbara had likely engaged in sexual intercourse, either consensually or unconsensually, around the time of her death, although no evidence of forcible molestation was found. The official death certificates of both Barbara and Patricia would list their cause of death as being murder, the specific means of which, in both cases, was listed as being secondary shock, resulting from exposure to low temperatures, which had reduced each girl's body temperature below the critical level compatible with life. One of the coroners to perform the autopsies, Walter McCarran, surmised the sisters' bodies had lain undiscovered behind the guardrail on German Church Road for many days before their eventual discovery, stating that the bodies' preserved condition, given the time interval between their disappearance and discovery, had been due to the frigid temperatures in the weeks prior to January 22nd, adding that this had been due to recent snowfalls and the frigid climate. McCarran also concluded the girls' bodies had lain undiscovered for more than 3 weeks because a layer of snow had blanketed the area on January 9th, and that this snowfall had rapidly melted in the days immediately prior to their discovery. Despite these official conclusions, the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Gloss, disagreed with the official time of death, later stating to the media there had been numerous marks of violence on the girls' faces, strongly indicative of their being the recipients of violence as opposed to post-mortem rodent infestation. Gloss also contended that a thin layer of ice found encrusted upon the sisters' bodies indicated they had most likely been alive until at least January 7th, since only after that date would there have been sufficient snowfall to react with the girls' natural body heat in such a climate, and thus create the layer of ice discovered upon their nude bodies in this location. Gloss contended this fact proved their bodies had been warm when their bodies had been deposited beside German Church Road, since only after January 7th had there been sufficient snow to create such an ice layer upon and around their bodies. In addition to these facts, Gloss also stated that both girls had been subjected to sexual assaults throughout their period of captivity, adding that the autopsy conducted upon Patricia had also discovered semen within the vaginal fluid swathed from her body, and that curdled milk had also been found in Barbara's stomach, when she is not known to have drunk milk either at home or at the cinema on the evening of December 28th. In my opinion, one of the strangest things about this case is that people saw these girls even after they were supposedly, pronounced dead. So let's talk about that. So between the last confirmed sighting of the sisters at the Brighton Theater on December 28th, 1956, and the subsequent discovery of their bodies 25 days later, several unconfirmed sightings of the sisters, both in and outside of Chicago, were reported to the Chicago Police Department. The most widely reported sightings include the following. Numerous people stated to investigators they had seen the girls boarding a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Archer Avenue heading east into the city after the Elvis movie screening. Those who reported this sighting to police included the bus driver. The sisters allegedly alighted this bus at Western Avenue, approximately halfway between the theater and their home. At approximately 11:05 p.m., why the sisters would alight the bus at Western Avenue is unknown. A young man named Roger Menard informed investigators he'd also attended the December 28th screening of Love Me Tender, having sat right behind Barbara and Patricia and close to Weinert. According to Menard, he had left the theater approximately 1 minute before the sisters, who had walked down Archer Avenue a short distance behind him before a late model green Buick had stopped alongside them. The girls hesitated before continuing walking. Just past 42nd Street, with the sisters by the stage walking ahead of him, a black 1949 Mercury, occupied by 2 teenage boys, pulled alongside the girls, although they simply giggled before continuing walking in the direction of their home. 2 teenage boys named Ed Lorden and Earl Zastro informed investigators that while they had been driving through McKinley Park at around 11:30 p.m. on December 28th, they saw the sisters on 35th Street. Reportedly, the two were giggling and jumping out of the doorways at each other. Near Seeley and Damien Avenues, with one youth exclaiming to the other two, were those 2 Grimes sisters as they passed them. At this point, the girls would have been approximately 2 blocks from their home. A security guard named Jack Franklin later informed investigators he had offered directions to 2 girls on the morning of December 29th, approximately 12 hours after they'd left the theater. This verbal exchange had allegedly occurred near Lawrence and Central Park Avenues, and Franklin later concluded the girls had been the Grimes sisters, adding the sole reason he had recalled this conversation was that both girls had been both rude and abrupt to him. On the same date of Franklin's alleged sighting of Barbara and Patricia, a friend of Barbara's named Judy Burrow reported to investigators she saw the sisters at approximately 2:30 p.m. walking westward on Archer Avenue. A classmate of Patricia's named Catherine Borak was adamant she had seen Patricia walking past a restaurant Borak had been inside in the early evening of December 29th. According to Borak, Patricia had been in the company of 2 unidentified young girls. This sighting was followed by another 6 hours later by a cashier at the Clark Theater in downtown Chicago who claimed she had seen both girls at 12:45 a.m. A railroad conductor named Bernard Norton reported seeing the 2 girls aboard a train near the Great Lakes Naval Training Center in north suburban Glenview. According to Norton, the 2 girls had been searching for 2 sailors named Terry and Larry. On December 30th at 5:40 a.m., the owner of the D&L restaurant at 1340 West Madison said he saw both girls, with Patricia apparently too drunk or sick to walk without staggering, accompanied by the official suspect, Edward Bedwell. This location was over 5.5 miles from the Brighton Theater. A clerk at the Claremont Hotel, after viewing the bodies at a mortuary, likewise identified the sisters as having checked into the hotel on this date. On January 1st, 1957, the girls were reported as having been seen aboard a Chicago Transit Authority bus on Damon Avenue. The following week, a night clerk at the Unity Hotel on West 61st Street refused 2 girls a room because of their age. This clerk believed the girls in question were the Grimes sisters. On January 3rd, 3 employees at an Englewood Crusade department store claimed to have seen both girls listening to music at the store's record counter. Each employee stated the sisters had been listening to music by Elvis Presley. Adding credence to the theory that both sisters had run away to Nashville, on January 17th, a woman named Pearl Melville contacted investigators to state she had met both girls in a restroom in this location on January 9th, and that she had accompanied them to a state employment agency to search for work. According to Neville, both girls had been in what she described as being a tired, bedraggled condition. A clerk at this agency would later identify the sisters from photographs, also recalling that both girls had used the surname Grimes in the application forms they had populated. In the early hours of January 14th, the parents of a classmate of Patricia Grimes named Sandra Tolstan received 2 separate anonymous telephone calls. During the first call, nobody at the other end spoke. Picking up the second phone call approximately 15 minutes later, Sandra's mother, Anne, heard a frightened and depressed young female voice asking, "Is that you, Sandra? Is Sandra there?" Before Anne could bring her daughter the phone, the call had been terminated. Mrs. Tolstan informed investigators of her conviction that the caller had been Patricia Grimes. Following the January 19th television and radio appeal by Elvis Presley imploring the sisters to return home, Chicago Sun-Times advice columnist Ann Landers received an anonymous letter, allegedly written by a girl who claimed to have witnessed the sisters being forced into a car by a young male on the night of their disappearance. Although a partial license number was provided with the letter, subsequent police endeavors to trace the vehicle proved fruitless. The author of this letter was never identified, and the actual contents were never authenticated. The suspects. So first we're going to talk about Edward Bedwell. So Edward Lee, or Benny Bedwell, was a 21-year-old semi-literate drifter, originally from Tennessee, who had been evicted from his family's East Garfield Park home in November 1956, and in the weeks preceding the Grimes sisters' murder, had occasionally earned money by working as a part-time dishwasher in Chicago's Skid Row restaurant. Bedwell was a tall individual who allegedly bore a strong resemblance to Elvis Presley. According to John and Minnie Duros, the owners of the restaurant where he had worked, he and another young male had been in the premises in the company of two girls who physically resembled the Grimes sisters in the early morning of December 30th. Duros conveyed this information to police on January 24th. Bedwell was arrested thereafter and subjected to interrogation for 3 days. Initially, Bedwell was insistent that John and Minnie Duros and a patron named Renee Ickles, who had corroborated the Duros' eyewitness statements, were mistaken in their identification of the girls he had been in the company of on December 30th, although he was formally charged with the sisters' murders on January 27, 1957, having signed a 14-page confession in which he claimed that he and a 28-year-old acquaintance of his named William Cole Willingham had indeed been in the company of the Grimes sisters on December 30th, having also retained their company until January 7th, typically drinking in various West Madison Skid Row saloons. According to Bedwell, after several days in the girls' willing company, shortly after he and his companion had fed the sisters hot dogs, they had extensively beaten both girls before throwing their nude bodies in a snow-filled ditch, when both sisters had refused their sexual advances. Upon reading Bedwell's confession, Loretta Grimes was quoted upon as stating, "It was a lie. My girls wouldn't be on West Madison Street. They didn't even know where it was." Willingham admitted he had been in the company of Bedwell and two girls in the early hours of December 30th, but denied the girls had been the Grimes sisters. He also emphatically denied any involvement in the murders. Bedwell himself would later recant the confession he had provided to investigators, stating that he'd only provided a confession after being held in custody for 4 days in the mistaken belief the police would subsequently release him if he did so. The autopsy reports upon both girls also supported Bedwell's recantation, as no alcohol or hot dogs were found in either victim's blood or digestive systems, nor had the girls been beaten to death. Furthermore, Bedwell is also known to have clocked in at Ajax Consolidated Company, his place of employment, from 4:19 p.m. on December 28, 1956 to 12:30 a.m. on December 29th. Covering the time period of the sisters' most likely abduction, with further records confirming Bedwell had been working in Cicero on the date he claimed to have murdered them. On February 6, Bedwell was freed on a $20,000 bond paid for by an individual from Champaign. The same year of his acquittal, Bedwell would be tried and acquitted for the 1956 rape of a 13-year-old girl in Oak Hill, Florida. He died in November 1972. Now for our next suspect. His name is Max Fleeg. So Max was a 17-year-old suspect in the sisters' murders. Initially considered one of the prime suspects due to his age, Fleeg was protected by contemporary Illinois laws which prevented juveniles from subjection to polygraph tests. Nonetheless, Chicago Police Captain Ralph Pentague persuaded the teenager to submit to an unofficial polygraph test, which Fleeg voluntarily took. In the course of this unofficial polygraph test, Fleeg allegedly confessed to the murders. With no legal means of using this test as evidence against him, police were forced to release him without charge. In addition, police were unable to charge Fleeg with the murders due to there being a lack of physical evidence corroborating his unofficial polygraph confession that he had kidnapped and subsequently killed the sisters. He was later jailed for the unrelated murder of another young woman. Our last suspect is Walter Kranz. He was a 53-year-old steamfitter and self-proclaimed psychic. Phoned a switchboard operator at Chicago Central Police Complaint Room on January 15th to inform the operator of his conviction that both sisters were deceased and their bodies could be found in an unincorporated area of Lyons Township. Kranz refused to disclose his name to the operator in the phone call, simply stating he had experienced this revelation in a dream. Before terminating the call, nonetheless, the operator was able to trace the call to a location close to his home. The park described by Kranz in his telephone call, would prove to be approximately 1 mile from the true location where the girls' bodies would just be found 1 week later. When questioned, Kranz informed the police that several members of his family and ancestors possessed psychic powers, and he had experienced this particular vision after a night of heavy drinking. Although initially considered by police to be their number one suspect in the murders, and with handwriting experts also determining he may have written a ransom note received by the girl's mother prior to their discovery of their daughter's bodies, Kranz denied any involvement in the sisters' abduction and murder. After being subjected to multiple interrogations, he was released. A police officer named Raymond Johnson began a personal investigation into the case. Johnson, considered by many to be an expert on the case, had become interested in the Grimes sisters' case in 2010, when he had been researching a book he had been writing about the city's history. Having extensively researched the case, Johnson had stated his conviction that the case is still a solvable one, but only with public assistance, and that he believes the perpetrator of this crime had been a 23-year-old self-confessed child killer named Charles Leroy Melquist, who had been considered a suspect in the sisters' abduction and murder in 1957. Melquist had been convicted of the September 1958 murder of a 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Lee Scott, whom he had known prior to her murder, and whose decapitated body had been found 2 months after her disappearance, less than 10 miles from where the Grimes sisters' body had been discovered. Following the discovery of Scott's body, investigators had noted similarities in this murder and the body disposal, and that of the Grimes sisters. Nonetheless, Melquist was never questioned as to his potential culpability in the Grimes sisters' murders, as his attorney had forbade him to be subject to questioning. The day after the body of Bonnie Lee Scott was discovered, Loretta Grimes received a phone call from an individual who on this occasion claimed responsibility for Scott's murder. On this occasion, the caller had stated, "I've committed another perfect crime. This is another one of those cops who won't solve, and they're not going to Bedwell or Barrett Cook." Loretta Grimes would remain adamant until her death. This caller had been the same individual who contacted her in May 1957 and had revealed the deformity upon one of her daughter's feet, which had never been released to the press or the public, stating, "I will never forget that voice." Charles Melquist was never charged with his alleged involvement in the deaths of the Grimes sisters. He died in 2010. So, what did you guys think of the case? Who do you think is most guilty? What do you think of the creepy phone calls and the fact that he knew about a deformity on one of the girls' feet? It's a shame that the mother isn't alive and probably not the father either, but hopefully this case can be solved if we just work together and keep spreading the message. Thank you for supporting this channel, and be sure to share this video because maybe someday we can actually find an answer.